Welcome. Welcome to Chesterwood. I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the interim director here for the summer season to help out with a very, very busy, action-packed season. Chesterwood is the home, studio, and gardens of Daniel Chester French and his family. They were here 6 months of the year, the best 6 months. Some of you may know, Stockbridge is the ancestral home of the Mohegan Indians. Their traditional homeland spanned from the Hudson River Valley to western Massachusetts, northern Connecticut, and southern Vermont. Unfortunately, they were forced from this land by the late 1700s. This property was purchased by a farmer from the Mohegans in 1772, and by the end of the decade, the Mohegans were forced to move. They are, however, still an active and federally recognized tribe. The Stockbridge Muncie community of Mohegan Indians resides in Wisconsin, and we maintain a relationship with that tribe. They come back here and work with us. Some of you may be interested to know that the Mission House on Main Street, there is an exhibit put together by the Mohegan Indians, and several Mohegan Indians will be speakers during late summer and early fall. So I encourage you to look for that program. Our featured artist.
Close the door. I think we should open it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Please.
It's because the music, yeah, the music was lovely. The nips tapped through it.
We need to prop it open. Our featured artist today is Georges Adéagbo, an award-winning found objects artist from Benin, who has been inspired by the life and work of Abraham Lincoln. As an American, my familiarity with Lincoln is basically the $5 bill and the seated Lincoln. So I've been fascinated to see how Georges responds as a Black African to the history and the tradition of Abraham Lincoln. Everywhere you look, there's something different, another way of looking at Abraham Lincoln. So this is a fascinating exhibit, and that is going to be the subject of today's discussion. This exhibition, which explores the themes of freedom and bondage, debuted at President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. The installation was made possible by Stefan Kohler of Culturforum Sud Nord. Stefan is with us today, and he's going to be assisting with translations because George speaks French. To talk about how this show ended up at Chesterwood, I'd like to introduce Omar Eaton Martinez, the National Trust's Vice President for Historic Sites, who in turn will introduce our moderator. And if you hear music in the background, because after this event, the World Jazz Combo Herd will be performing on the west porch of the main house, and we'll be partying on the piazza through that door, and we'll be able to hear them. If it's rainy, you can stay on the piazza. If it's not rainy, you can dance on the lawn. Omar.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, to come all the way from Washington, D.C. Actually, I was in Nashville before for a conference. But I was excited to be here and participate in this artist talk. I had the awesome opportunity to be able to see the great work that he did in our co-stewardship site at President Lincoln's Cottage. And I know from talking to Michael Mason, and I guess Stefan and George will have to confirm or deny, you were working with the Park Service and trying to get some things done there. And then we saw the opportunity to connect with you, and you all did your work over at President Lincoln's Cottage. And then we have a site directors meeting where we bring in all of our site directors from all across the country. We have 27 sites. And we went to go visit President Lincoln's Cottage right before the installation. And Michael, of course, the president of President Lincoln's Cottage, was very excited about this opportunity. And so he was speaking to us about it, and Margaret was there, and Valerie was there, and we said, oh, well, this makes sense for you to be able to do this work at President Lincoln's Cottage, to come up to Chesterwood, where we also have a Lincoln connection, to bring this great work here. And so I believe that's how we ended up here. And I always have to lean on the great brilliance of my colleagues, Margaret Sharon and Valerie Balin. So I want to acknowledge them for that. And I'm just happy that this finally came here so I can witness this here with you. And so I am the Senior Vice President of Historic Sites. I get to work with all these wonderful sites across the country. We have stewardship sites, co-stewardship sites, which we are in partnership with another nonprofit, and we have affiliates as well. And so with that, I will go ahead and introduce Karen Milborn, the Curator of African Art, who will be moderating the panel. And of course, we'll have Stefan and George come before you and talk to you about what they did. Please give them a round of applause.
So first of all, thank you all so much for being here on this steamy summer afternoon. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And thank you very much, everyone, for Margaret and Omar for the lovely introduction, Michael as well for the lovely introduction, and Margaret for all of your efforts in bringing us here together. I wanted to start actually by talking a little bit about the journey of your interest in Abraham Lincoln. And I actually first learned about this about 10 years ago, I think. I was trying to remember the exact year, but we were on the roof of a really lovely hotel in Dakar, Senegal, having lunch. And George was telling me about how he had been to see the Lincoln Memorial and had always dreamed about then doing an installation there. And so I'm a curator at the Smithsonian and immediately started seeing all of the red tape and bureaucratic hurdles of trying to figure out how to make such a thing possible. And instead, over the years, then I nominated, along with another colleague, George, to have what's called a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. And so through that fellowship, he was able to come from Cotonou and do research at the Smithsonian, which was then further disrupted by COVID. And so he was the first artist to actually get to come back in and do research. And so I thought maybe you could just talk a little bit about your journey with Lincoln, and then we can talk about a little bit about the journey of this project. And just a final note, after Chesterwood, this installation is actually going into this collection of the Smithsonian. And so it will come home to the museum later this fall.
Alors, elle aimerait savoir un peu du parcours de ton intérêt à Abraham Lincoln. Tu avais raconté que tu as la première rencontre et le développement de tes recherches d'Abraham Lincoln.
Merci d'être venu. C'est-à-dire, je ne sais pas de quelle manière les gens, après la lecture, est-ce que les gens parviennent à réfléchir sur ce que j'ai lu? Le fait d'avoir lu l'histoire d'Abraham dans la Bible, c'est-à-dire, après l'avoir lu, je réfléchis, mais comment cette histoire s'est passée, et puis comme c'est-à-dire de la manière, on dit la voix prise pour demander et la voix qui pousse à donner.
Ça, c'était avant que tu aies jamais vu le monument. So George said before ever coming to the United States and seeing the Lincoln Memorial, he has been reading about Abraham in the Old Testament, and he's been thinking about, well, how do people read? Do they get into the different levels, dimensions of a story which is passed on over hundreds of years? And then
Donc, après avoir lu dans la Bible l'histoire d'Abraham, et par chance, arrivé aux États-Unis, puis invité par Pierre Swan à New York, l'occasion s'est présentée à ce qu'on se rende à Washington. Arrivé à Washington, on se baladait, et baladant, brusquement, je m'étais trouvé devant le monument. Devant le monument, j'ai demandé à Stéphane, mais quel est ce monument? Il me dit, mais c'est Abraham Lincoln. J'ai dit, donc l'histoire que j'ai lue dans la Bible, c'est quelque chose de réalisé parce que j'ai vu des monuments, Napoléon, J.T. Gaulle, tout et tout, mais ce n'est pas, c'est-à-dire ça ne présente pas l'aspect que ça se présente ici.
George, he says, I was invited to an exhibition at PS1 on Long Island, which is now part of MoMA, in the year 2000, and I made an installation about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham l'ami de Dieu was the name of the installation, and after the opening we took a trip to Washington DC, and while doing sightseeing in Washington DC, he was at the Lincoln Memorial and he was overwhelmed and moved and surprised and say, okay, I read about Abraham Lincoln in the Bible, and now you see Abraham Lincoln in this wonderful monument, and you see monuments of kings and queens in Europe all over, but they're outside, they're exposed to rain and snow, and here's finally someone who is honored and given respect in the way he deserves.
Donc, après avoir vu le monument, j'ai cru à la création de Dieu, que quelqu'un qui a fait du bien a toujours sa place près de Dieu.
So when you do good, you'll be recognized and you will be respected. So he felt that as a confirmation. And then Josh, should you have questions, or should he continue the next step of Philadelphia Museum, or should we talk?
I was just going to say, people should know that installation did go in ultimately to the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I think it's interesting to think about then how you've made more than one portrait, if you will, and what it means to re-engage with the subject of Lincoln in these different contexts.
Yeah. Alors, il dit que tu étais Carlos Basualdo, qui était à New York, t'a invité à Philadelphia Museum of Art, et tu as fait des recherches à Philadelphia, tu as ajouté des éléments, parce que tu peux nommer un élément que tu as ajouté, et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de c'est la cloche.
C'était déjà 2007, ça fait quoi? Ça fait longtemps, je ne me rappelle plus de...
La cloche.
À part la cloche, oui. À part la cloche,
mais comment c'était de travailler avec l'installation, de modifier et que c'est maintenant la collection?
Donc, les gens ont lu la Bible comme moi, mais la croyance, comme moi j'ai eu, la croyance que j'ai eue sur la lecture faite, je me demande aussi d'autres parviennent à avoir de telles croyances. Parce que là, c'est-à-dire devant le monument, j'ai vu, c'est-à-dire en large, c'est-à-dire comment Dieu récompense ceux qui ont suivi ces consignes.
Mais elle voudrait savoir si l'installation à Philadelphia ou le développement de l'œuvre, est-ce que tu veux dire quelque chose sur ça?
Pour le développement de l'œuvre, c'est-à-dire Abraham, l'ami de Dieu, j'ai confirmé, c'est-à-dire, quand j'ai dit j'ai confirmé, c'est-à-dire de la manière que j'ai lu et de la manière que je me suis vu devant la vérité.
So he says creating a new version for the Philadelphia Museum of Art was a way for him to have a more profound sense and confirmation about what he said before, that persons who merit or do something or sacrifice themselves for good also get recognition. So I may add personally in Philadelphia, he added, for example, he saw the Liberty Bell with a crack, and he had brought pictures of that back to Benin, and he had a Liberty Bell with a crack carved in Benin and brought it back to Philadelphia. And the piece is now in the museum's collection.
So one thing I did want to say is that this really is intended to be an informal conversation, so we're going to encourage you all to get to ask questions as well. But for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to see Georges' work elsewhere, it's really characterized by what you can see here around you, interventions in the space, and it's very much a dialogue with the space in which he finds himself working. So you'll see paintings and books here, commission carvings, works that he's purchased, books that he's found on daily quests, and album covers, and then sometimes they're combined into in this case, these shadow boxes that hold microcosm installations, if you will. And so they look different in each and every venue. And every installation is always site-specific. And so it's been fascinating to watch the journey of this project as it went from Lincoln's Cottage, where it was spread over multiple rooms and responding to mantles and to the desk where Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, to coming here and the way, and we'll get to in the future a conversation more about the materials and the dialogue between two artists, but to I'd like to have Georges tell people a little bit about his process, and in particular, you know, his collaborations with Benoit and Hugues, the painter from whom he commissions these works, and the sculptor he's also commissioned some work.
So, j'aimerais savoir comment, en général, comment tu produis une œuvre. Est-ce que tu fais des peintures, des sculptures toi-même, ou comment ça marche, ou est-ce que tu as une équipe?
Moi, mon travail artistique, c'est une demande et l'offre. Et quand je parle de demande et l'offre, tant que les gens ne portent pas à ma connaissance ce qu'ils veulent, ce qu'ils aiment avoir, moi je ne pourrais pas avoir la possibilité de leur parler de ce que je peux leur offrir.
So my kind of working is like demand and offer. So I always dialogue with the persons who invite me for exhibitions and discuss with them a theme and ask them what they want and what they need. So he feels like he's more doing custom-made, tailor-made projects. It's not that he does any kind of arbitrary. That's what I add personally now. Arbitrary. He's not an artist who makes paintings and sculptures in his studio that someday he will exhibit in any arbitrary space. Every project is linked to a conversation with the curators, what is wanted and needed, where he shows. Mais en particulier, comment ça marche?
Particulièrement, c'est-à-dire on a les yeux pour voir. Et quand les yeux voient, les yeux envoient ce qu'ils ont vu au cerveau. Et le cerveau travaille sur ce que les yeux lui ont porté à connaissance, et c'est de là qu'on arrive à trouver la possibilité de faire comprendre aux gens ce qu'ils doivent comprendre et ne veulent pas comprendre.
Alors, you have to just open your eyes and observe and collect information and present it in a way that people are inspired to go deeper and think and understand what you're talking about. Et dans le sens pratique, comment ça marche? Tu vas à un lieu et qu'est-ce que tu ramasses et qu'est-ce que tu amènes au Bénin? Comment ça marche?
C'est-à-dire, le fait, parler de ce que je trouve dans la nature. On dit mais le plus souvent que l'art est dans la nature. C'est l'art qui fait l'artiste, ce n'est pas l'artiste qui fait l'art. L'artiste est un missionnaire qui accomplit la mission qui est là dans la nature. Mais prenons l'exemple sur la découverte du pétrole. Ce n'est pas la population qui découvre le pétrole. C'est une personne dans la population qui parvient à découvrir le pétrole. On sait que on a le pétrole chez nous. Et c'est la même chose pour ce que j'ai découvert dans la nature. Quand des gens passent à côté des choses, ils ne voient pas, ça ne leur dit pas quelque chose. Mais moi, quand arrivé, là, j'y vais, je trouve des choses, je les dépasse. J'arrive sur une chose, ça je dois prendre. Et aussitôt que j'ai pris, je prends mon bic, je peux écrire là-dessus.
Et après, on va... So George talks about finding, and maybe you know the word serendipity, or being open and have eyes and be open to see things that are on your path. And he says it's not, he discusses a lot in his work the authorship, like it's not the ego of the artist that is creating the artwork. He writes in many installations, and you will see it on some paintings. And by the way, all the texts that you see on paintings and banners are translated and available either as printouts and handouts or right directly next to the painting. So he writes in many paintings like art is in nature. It's not the artist who makes the art, it's the art that makes the artist. So it's like he's playing with the authorship idea and also the ego of the artist, of claiming of authorship. but I tried to get him to talk in practical. How does he do these installations? How do we do that to make him talk?
I'm going to draw everyone's attention actually to one that's specific to this location that I just am having a little love affair with. So I'm going to direct your attention to this wall here, and you can see the casts of Daniel Chester French are in white, and then there is a black hand that's suspended, and so that's one that Georges decided to commission from another Béninois artist, Hugues Huntunji. Forgive my pronunciation. And then when he was here in Stockbridge, he was wandering the used vinyl store and found the album that shows the fingers, the Loverboy album. And so it's this then beautiful formal conversation that you have going on between gestures and across continents. But I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about your own thoughts when you were commissioning the hand from Hugues, why you thought to do that, and what you thought when you found that album.
Elle demande comment ça, parce que tu as eu en janvier, tu as pris des photos d'ici, et puis tu as commandé la main, et aussi tu as commandé Andromeda de sculpteurs, et après tu as trouvé la disque ici dans la boutique de disques ici à Stockbridge. Comment ça se passe dans ta tête? Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Mais ce qui s'est passé est que, c'est-à-dire, en se déplaçant, on doit s'attendre toujours à quelqu'un. C'est-à-dire, il y a quelqu'un qui m'attend. Et le fait que cette personne m'attendant, pour prouver que vraiment, bon, c'est-à-dire, parce que j'ai pris ce chemin que je n'ai pas l'habitude de prendre. Aujourd'hui, je prends ce chemin, c'est qu'il y a quelque chose qui me dit, me prends ce chemin parce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui t'attend. Est-ce que, bon, en donnant cette sculpture de main à lui, est-ce qu'on s'attendait à venir trouver ici à Chesterwood,
Stockbridge,
Donc, c'est pour ça que je dis, l'art est dans la nature. C'est l'art qui fait l'artiste, ce n'est pas l'artiste qui fait l'art. Parce que en donnant le fait que j'ai donné la main à sculpter à Hugues, si je n'ai pas pu trouver, c'est-à-dire le disque qui parle de cette main qui devait figurer dans l'installation, aujourd'hui, bon, j'ai placé la sculpture, bon, parce que ça ne dirait rien aux gens. Donc, c'est que, c'est-à-dire la main, tout ce qui, le devenir de l'être humain est dans les paumes de la main. Ça ne peut pas s'effacer. Donc, cela ne pourra pas s'effacer. Raison pour laquelle, ayant donné la sculpture, arrivé à Chesterwood, j'ai trouvé le disque.
So George says, when you're moving around, but in a way you are influenced, or there's always someone or something waiting for you somewhere. So in a way, he ordered the hand to be carved in Benin before he found the record. But he says on the other hand, if he hadn't found the record, he might not even have used it. It wouldn't have made sense. So, but somehow, maybe I can summarize it up. He creates these systems where one thing attracts the other. So there is a certain, c'est une énergie qui les choses s'attirent un à l'autre.
I'm trying to decide. I have two different questions I want to ask right now, so I've got to figure out which way to go. So I'm going to actually go with the title of the exhibition, which is Create to Free Yourselves. And I love that the title is a directive. It's not saying I created to free myself. It's inviting everybody here to create to free themselves. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, like that this was a creative energy that took place, and what is the creative energy you're hoping that everybody assembled here today will carry on?
Voilà, elle aime le titre parce que c'est une invitation. Ce n'est pas le titre, ce n'est pas moi j'ai créé et je me suis libéré. Plutôt, tu as donné le titre créer pour vous libérer, create to free yourselves, only your creation, and so on and so on. So, like, est-ce que tu peux parler un peu sur le titre et
Et la méthodologie.
Et oui, tes méthodes de travailler.
Moi, c'est ma méthode. C'est-à-dire, ma méthode, je ne peux pas l'imposer aux autres. De la manière. C'est pour ça que je disais que les yeux peuvent voir ce que les yeux ont vu. Ils envoient ça au cerveau et le cerveau réfléchit là-dessus. Moi, j'ai dit créer pour vous libérer. Et pourquoi j'ai dit prier pour vous libérer? Aujourd'hui, le monde entier, jusqu'à la début des siècles, on parle de l'esclavage. Parlant de l'esclavage, personne n'est arrivé à expliquer ce que c'est que l'esclavage. Dieu ne nous ayant pas créé, c'est pour ça que je dis, mais les yeux voient. Dieu nous a créés. Dieu nous créant, ne nous a pas créés esclaves. Dieu ne nous ayant pas créés esclaves, comment sommes-nous devenus esclaves après la création?
So George, I translate the other way around. So the last sentence was, God created the world without slavery. How come that man created slavery? So that's why he started to think about this title, and he says the eyes see and send the messages, impulses to the brain, and the brain starts to react and create new things. But tu parles un peu sur tes méthodes, comment tu travailles avec les gens. Then he said he has his way of working and he doesn't want to impose it or can it impose it on others.
Ce que tu demandes.
But that's not the same thing as what do you want others to take away?
D'après la question que tu poses, ma méthode, c'est ma méthode. Ma méthode ne peut pas être notre méthode. Parce que moi, c'est-à-dire, ce que je vois, c'est de ça que je montre. Je me regarde. Le fait de te demander regarder, c'est que je te pousse à réfléchir à ce que tu vois.
Yeah, George wants people to encourage to really look, observe, and discover for themselves, but with their own eyes and with their own head. No one can use his eyes or his head. That's why there's on some paintings, on one painting there's the text, I need a head, it's only my head that I need because I cannot work with somebody else's head or eyes. But George has not talked about his everyday life of bringing images home and sharing it with his team of artisans. How can we make him talk about that? Maybe it's
Maybe if I ask him a question about something else completely, he'll go there. Because one of the other questions, and I know I promised that I wouldn't get too academic here, but I do want to refer to, there's a very interesting scholar by the name of Jane Bennett, and she's one of a school of scholars who write about something called vital materialism. And the idea behind vital materialism is that every physical object, it could be gel, it doesn't have to be a cohesive form, but that everything has an energy, and that we are all in a world where objects are not impassive, but they push back and interact with the world that we live in. And so that's why the materialism of them is vital. It is a living materialism, and that's something that I certainly see in your work. And so my question to you is one, in thinking about the materials and what you're bringing together, and secondly, what it means to you here in relationship to another artist's work, and maybe thinking a little bit about how you approach materials and how Daniel Chester French approaches sculpture and painting and so forth.
Alors, elle a vu qu'il y a, tu as parlé que les choses ont l'énergie, qui les guide un objet à l'autre, qui te attire, qui te demande à les prendre, et aussi l'importance de la vie des matériaux. Et là, on a parlé ce matin aussi sur les matériaux, quelle est pour comparer ta manière de travailler. Par exemple, Daniel Chester French, il travaille avec la terre, il fait des sculptures, et tu travailles des choses. Tu peux parler un peu ce que tu as senti à travers Daniel Chester French's manière de faire des sculptures avec la terre directement, avec ses mains.
Je vais raconter une histoire. Bon, le
I
caméléon,
will tell you a story.
le caméléon, un jour, bon, le caméléon s'était levé, il est parti voir Dieu, dit, mais Dieu, tu ne m'aimes pas. Mais Dieu a dit, mais qu'est-ce que tu voudrais dire par je ne t'aime pas?
So one day the chameleon woke up and said, went to God and says, God, I have a feeling you don't love me. And God said, why, dear chameleon, you feel that I don't like you?
Il dit, mais il faut regarder, tu as donné des beaux habits à tous les animaux, mais moi, l'habit que tu m'as donné, mais ça ne me convenait pas.
And so you gave beautiful clothes to all other animals, but you didn't give me any nice clothes. Look how ugly I am.
Dieu a dit, l'habit que je t'ai donné, ça ne te convenait pas. Tu vois que ça ne te va pas. Mais ce que tu ne comprends pas, ce que tu ignores est que, c'est-à-dire, en allant et arriver à cet endroit où j'ai eu l'idée à te créer, c'est la terre de cet endroit que j'ai pris pour te créer.
So then God said that you misunderstand me. So I gave you the color that of the earth where I was standing and thinking about making a chameleon. So that's why you got this earth color, and you shouldn't be sad.
Dieu a dit, bon d'accord, mais si l'habit que je t'ai donné ne te va pas, maintenant toi-même il faut que tu ailles chercher ton habit.
So then God says, okay, if you don't like that earth color, go and search your own color and your own clothes.
Donc, le caméléon, bon d'accord, je vais aller chercher moi-même mon habit. Le caméléon est parti. Le caméléon arrivé au premier ciel. Bon, il a pris, c'est-à-dire quand il a pris la couleur du premier ciel, mais quand il s'est bougé un peu, la couleur du premier ciel l'a quitté. Il est rentré dans le deuxième ciel.
So the chameleon goes from different heaven to heaven. So he was in the blue heaven. The first heaven is blue, so the chameleon became blue. Then the chameleon left and came to the second sky heaven and
Deuxième ciel, il a quitté, rentré dans le troisième. Il a pris la couleur.
Changing again color and color and color.
Bon, il allait. Il est arrivé au sixième ciel.
Came to the sixth heaven.
Il a pris la couleur du sixième ciel, prenant la couleur du sixième ciel, bougé, rentré dans le septième, il a pris la couleur. Là, il dit, mais comment ça?
And then the chameleon says, what's going on? I'm changing color all the time.
Là, il s'est retourné pour venir voir Dieu. Mais Dieu, quand Dieu lui a dit, mais tu es revenu avec l'habit que je t'avais donné.
And then the chameleon went back to see God, and God said, but you come back the same color that you started with.
Tu es revenu avec le même habit. Donc tu vois que là, ce que je t'ai dit, là où je t'ai trouvé, et j'ai eu l'idée à te créer, et prenant cette terre, c'est ça qui fait que l'habit que tu portes, tu dois le porter.
Okay, so that means that you have this color and you have to
Et
be happy with it.
c'est-à-dire pour m'exprimer, c'est-à-dire en voyant, quand je dis, c'est-à-dire je trouve, c'est-à-dire les gens peuvent passer par là, ils vont trouver, ils ne vont rien dire, ils vont dépasser. Moi, je vais prendre et en
So I pick up many things that people throw away or walk by, but I see something in it, and that's why I take it. Yeah, he picks it. Yeah.
Bon, et la preuve est que, c'est-à-dire, bon, je suis africain. Étant africain, bon, j'ai lu la Bible, bon, j'ai lu Abraham dans la Bible, mais comment ça? Bon, il a fait le sacrifice, il y a un sacrifice à faire, il a fait le sacrifice, c'est ça qui lui a donné la gloire et l'honneur et tout. Et brusquement, mais le fait de réfléchir sur ce que j'ai lu, mais la chance est présentée à moi, je suis venu aux États-Unis, à Washington, j'ai vu le monument.
Yeah. So basically he talks about slumbering stories. He has been reading as a young boy in Benin. He has been also to a Catholic school. He has been reading about Abraham, the sacrifice of Abraham, and so on and so on. So then it was so interesting that that sensitized him also to react towards the Lincoln Memorial and also to reading about Abraham Lincoln's achievements and abolition of Yeah, et qu'est-ce que tu as
Le
senti?
non, mais le fait, il faut voir, c'est-à-dire la faute d'Abraham Lincoln assis, mais pourquoi il s'est permis à faire la main gauche, cet homme à la main gauche, et ça dans ça.
So George thinks a lot about this sculpture. One hand is closed, one hand is open, one foot is in front, one foot is back.
C'est une écriture, c'est pour ça que j'ai mis le point. Rien ne sert de courir et rien ne sert de t'accourir.
So that's why I wrote also on this painting, point, point, point. Running doesn't help if you don't start in the right moment.
Donc, les gens voient, mais ça, c'est une écriture dans la nature. Tout le monde voit, mais ah oui, mais il y a l'écriture. Pourquoi il a la main gauche comme ça et la main droite?
Everything has a meaning, basically, he says. There's something to think about.
Donc, ce que moi j'ai ressenti à travers la photo d'Abraham assis, c'est de ça que j'ai dit, ah ça, franchement, Dieu a créé, il y a des généraux, mais ces généraux n'ont pas eu un espace, c'est-à-dire un espace comme l'espace où se trouve le monument.
So, then Lincoln found a special monument. But please, Josh, je t'en prie, parle un peu comment tu vois la manière que Daniel Chester French travaille avec les matériaux. C'est ça qui nous intéresse. Et là, par rapport, il travaille avec les matériaux, mais c'est un autre qui fait les sculptures marbre. Est-ce qu'il y a un parallèle avec ta manière de travailler?
Tu me poses une question. C'est-à-dire, en me posant une question, moi aussi, mais je peux te poser une question. Qu'est-ce que tu sais du destin?
So you ask me many questions, I can ask you also questions.
Okay.
What do you know? What do you know about destiny?
Qu'est-ce que tu parles du destin? Quand tu regardes la paume de ta main.
You look at your hand and you see the lines on your hand.
C'est-à-dire, si ce que j'ai dit est mal dit, c'est-à-dire tu vois, c'est-à-dire cette main, ça existait. Cela existant, c'est-à-dire les gens réfléchissent sur ça, et le fait que à venir travailler dans l'espace de Daniel Chesterwood, on a eu cette idée de faire la sculpture, raison pour laquelle, arrivé, on a trouvé le disque.
No, he says his work is about destiny and the sequence of things that are all related. But
tu ne peux pas parler de Daniel Chesterwood, mais il a fait, c'était dit que moi il y aura un président et Daniel Chesterwood,
Chester French
est quelqu'un qui viendrait faire, c'est-à-dire une sculpture qui ferait voir la philosophie, l'idée philosophique de
so George says it was predestined that Daniel Chester French made this very important monument of Abraham Lincoln and showing the character and the charisma of Lincoln.
I want to leave time for others to ask questions and also for you to ask questions of them, because that is a fair point. But one of the things that each time I go through, and I do see something new, and you know, I was struck earlier today by one of the paintings in the main hall where you were talking about plastic bags and the presence of plastic bags and linen. And it was interesting to me to see that in the sequence of archival images about Lincoln. And I was just thinking about that relationship and what you're saying now in terms of everything has a destiny and how these things are connected, these materials, your materials, Chester French's materials, and how all of these connect. And so I was really struck by that insertion of that conversation. So that's one. But the other thing that you haven't touched on today, but I see in your work, and maybe it's intentional or not, but love. I mean, there's so much about how ideas and bodies and connections happen. That you see entangled bodies and entangled ideas in your work, and I just was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit about some of those connections and finally sort of the idea of love in your practice.
Parce qu'elle voit à travers les rencontres des idées, des histoires, des objets, des matériaux, et le thème l'amour. Alors, comment tu vois dans tes installations, comment tu parles de l'amour?
Tout d'abord, il faut chercher à savoir ce que c'est que l'amour. Il faut chercher à savoir ce que c'est que l'amour. L'amour n'est pas ce que beaucoup croient.
So you have to know what love is. Love is not what many people believe it is. So,
L'amour, c'est-à-dire, mais c'est se regarder, regarder dans la même direction. Quand on parle de regarder dans la même direction, c'est-à-dire ceux qui viendraient, c'est-à-dire, on dit plus souvent, mais qui a fait du bien, se verrait avec du bien, et qui a fait du mal, se verrait avec du mal.
so there's one sentence actually about love on one of the paintings. It says, love is not looking at each other, but being together and looking in the same direction. So that's one sentence we can find. I don't remember which painting it is, but maybe I can direct you later.
Qui t'aime et qui ferait la vérité et te dire la vérité. C'est-à-dire s'aimer ne se trouve pas dans le mensonge.
Oui, so love is not telling each other like pleasantries, but it's also having the courage to tell the other person the truth of what you feel and what you see.
Et quand je parle de ça, bon, avoir cette école, c'est-à-dire le monument, et avoir dans le jardin, bon, Abraham qui est debout, les mains comme ça, ça veut dire aussi, c'est-à-dire, il a donné, c'est-à-dire, il s'est fait voir d'une autre manière que, c'est-à-dire, c'est-à-dire,
George talks about the Lincoln sculpture, which is at the end of the garden, behind the barn. So that's also very interesting, intriguing. Yeah.
C'est-à-dire, Jésus ne devait pas être crucifié. C'était un sacrifice que Jésus devait faire. Le sacrifice étant fait. Et bon, le monde ne voyant pas pourquoi il a fait le sacrifice, bon, c'est-à-dire, dans les dernières heures, Jésus a penché sa tête à gauche.
So George talks about sacrifices and not recognized sacrifices, as for example, Jesus died on the cross and turned his.
Il a pensé sa tête à gauche et puis là, bon, il est mort. Il est mort le troisième jour, il est monté dans les cieux et il était assis à la droite de son père. Et c'est pour cela que bon, il a fait sortir son voilà quoi. Aujourd'hui, mais l'Amérique, les États-Unis ont eu des présidents, mais c'est-à-dire la place d'Abraham, c'est-à-dire le monde ne va pas oublier quoi.
Maybe we should also just face the questions.
Yes. Please do.
He is a cultural philosopher.
Yes.
Is what he is. And does he then, this particular installation is around Abraham Lincoln and your love for him as relates to your African roots and your memory. If you go to St. Louis, Missouri, and you are requested to do an exhibit, would then you leave this installation behind and pick up things from that culture that would reflect what you feel in your heart to show to the visitors? Does that make sense?
Going to where? Where is it?
As an example, St. Louis.
Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying? I'm just trying to understand.
It's for Georges to answer, but he has made many installations around the world. So just so folks know, I mean, he is an internationally traveled and sought after artist who has had exhibitions in Tokyo, most recently in Madrid, where the subject matter was quite different.
So the subject matter in Madrid reflected that culture and how it impressed him.
Well, why don't you talk a bit about?
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, because there are many different.
You who's right about his work.
Yeah, and there are many different themes. As he said, my work is demand and offer. So each town or each place where he has an exhibition, he has a different theme and does different research. So in Hamburg last year, he had an exhibition in the Museum of Ernst Barlach, a famous German sculptor. So he was dialoguing with this artist, with a German artist who died already in the 30s. But that's about Hamburg and also this artist. And in Madrid, he had also, it was an exhibition about microforms of revolutions and small forms of persistence and resilience and revolutions, following the philosophies of Deleuze and Guattari. So George made a piece called La Révolution et les Révolutions, so it was about different forms of resistance. So, and it included elements and things from Madrid, from vernacular cultures, but also specifically about ideas about resistance and revolution. So that's
Fascinating.
yeah.
He's inspired by where he is.
I have a question for you about, I believe you said that after this exhibit, Georges will go to the Smithsonian, and are you saying that this version will go, or what will go, and how will you do an installation of his work in the Smithsonian?
Check back with me next week. So Georges is traveling to Washington, D.C., returning in a few days, and that is actually a site visit to think about how the materials that he brought to Chesterwood, because everything that's part of Chesterwood remains here, but to take the ideas and think about then what they mean in that space and how to adapt them to that space. And again, other museums have acquired his work. So the example that he gave at the beginning, where he created Abraham, Friend of God, at PS1 in New York, but it was later acquired by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so he had to think about what that installation meant in Philadelphia. So this one started at Lincoln's Cottage, where it was very different. So for those of you who haven't been to Lincoln's Cottage, it's made up of, I think, 6 different rooms? 9, sorry. Multiple rooms. And there are mantles, because of course, that was the heating system, was the fires at that time. So most of the work is installed on mantelpieces or the few pieces of furniture that are there. So it felt very, very different than it does here, where one of the paintings is removed from the painting cases and replaced with one of Georges' commission. So how it looks is completely different. So what it's going to be when it comes to us will be very, very different. But we were actually talking about that for a couple hours this afternoon, thinking about some of the strategies, and then he'll come and we'll see what happens. And one of the things that's interesting for our museum is, you can see over here, just behind the audience, there's a portrait of Frederick Douglass. And when the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art was actually founded, it was before it didn't become the Smithsonian for 15 years. So in those first 15 years, it actually was based in Frederick Douglass's former home, in A Street in Washington, D.C. And so we were started as a response to the Civil Rights Movement, and our original name was the Center for Cross-Cultural Understanding. And so it's going to be very interesting then to see things like the Frederick Douglass portrait coming back home to an institution that has that connection. And that was one of the things we were talking about, is how he may want to expand on that for us.
I'm glad I don't have your job.
But it's also interesting to talk with George about spaces, and tu peux parler un peu, tu dis souvent un espace, on ne peut pas s'imposer un espace, on doit voir l'esprit d'espace et de dialoguer avec celui pour avoir un bon...
En ce qui concerne l'installation, c'est faire voir quelque chose, c'est aller à la recherche de la vérité, c'est aller à la recherche de la vérité et faire voir la vérité aux gens. avoir bon, c'est-à-dire, pourquoi le monument n'est pas fait en granit et que c'est fait en marbre?
Yeah, it's also he thinks about the materiality, like it could have been made of granite, but why is it marble, for example? The realization and the choice of material. Mais parce que l'expo était à Lincoln Cottage, maintenant c'est ici, ça va aller dans le Smithsonian à DC. Comment qu'est-ce que c'est dit? Comment tu parles avec l'espace? Quel est ton rapport avec l'espace?
Mais le rapport avec l'espace, c'est que dans tout espace, il y a un esprit. Donc, l'esprit étant dans l'espace, est arrivé. Alors, il faut d'abord regarder, observer l'espace. Quand l'espace observé, comment tu peux agir dans l'espace.
So George says when you go to see an exhibition space, he has a basic feeling that each space has a spirit, and you have to, when you enter a space, a house, a museum, or a historic space, you have to be quiet and listen and get in touch with that spirit, and then start to do your work.
Et il faut remarquer, par exemple, à Abraham Cottage, Lincoln Cottage, c'est-à-dire il y a des chambres où Abraham même a écrit contre le mur. Quelqu'un, un artiste invité, a travaillé dans cet espace et ne regarde pas, réfléchit ce qu'Abraham même voudrait dire par cette écriture.
No, he was very inspired at Lincoln Cottage, for example, by the quotes of Abraham Lincoln's key phrases on the walls. But now we have more space for like one or two more questions.
La preuve ici, quand on est arrivé, à voir les bâches, c'est-à-dire tout ce qu'on a amené de Lincoln Cottage, c'est-à-dire arrivé ici, ayant vu l'espace, tu as vu, si tu te rappelles, la première des choses, où est le pavillon? Le pavillon des États-Unis, c'est ça que j'ai demandé, c'est-à-dire la première des choses.
So it's always the first element, and then the first element placed, others follow, as if they're all connected. So in this installation, the first thing he pulled out was the big American flag, and it's in the middle room, it's in the Morris
La première
studio.
chose, c'est ça. J'ai demandé où est le flag. Où est-ce que Michael a envoyé le flag? Et parce que le flag, c'est ça qui parle du début de l'histoire. L'histoire est écrite, mais l'histoire étant écrite, qui peut-on y croire dans l'histoire?
Okay, so there's also the flag and the stories about the flag, the history of a country. So he wonders, like, which version of the many historians writing, because history is rewritten by each generation. So which version to believe?
So we only have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Your work is about the slave trade and objects, and you're bringing in all these modern objects too, and I'm wondering if there's any comment you're also making about the way that the global economy works and the interplay between the continents of those that are producing and not making as much money and buying each other's goods, and sort of the modern state of trade. Is there a comment that you're making about that?
Alors, il demande, il a vu, tu parles sur l'esclavage, mais aussi, il demande maintenant, il y a beaucoup de déséquilibre entre ceux qui donnent des ressources et l'autre produit qui font beaucoup d'argent. Est-ce qu'il y a des commentaires ou des pensées dans ton œuvre sur le circuit des objets et des produits des échanges commerciaux mondiaux?
Si tu me poses cette question, c'est comme tu demandes, j'ai pas de situation, et je me suis reporté à la beauté de la femme pour dire que je vais la prendre en mariage. Parce que bon, n'ayant pas de situation et à vouloir prendre une femme qui est belle, mais comment je vais vivre avec la femme? Donc ça fait partie de l'Italie. Bon, la femme me montre, je suis belle, mais tu veux m'avoir. Mais qu'est-ce que tu fais? Tu ne fais rien. Ne faisant rien, mais si la femme commet des bêtises, est-ce que tu peux réagir? Donc l'histoire d'esclavage, ce sont des choses que c'est en regardant soi-même, on peut arriver à savoir comment
as usually, George does not answer questions directly, so he says you have to have a situation also to, if you want to, how do you say it, dote or ask a woman to marry you, you have also to show that you can, you are a serious person to entertain or make a living for your family and for her. My experience, as I can say, it's inherent in his work as he picks up on the beach, Chinese, like the waves bring in, how do you call that what's washed on the shore. It's lots of plastic things from China, and like flip-flops and shoes and clothes and bags, and he brings them back, for example, to exhibitions in China. I mean, he's just like, by picking up objects that are discarded, that are the detritus of our consumerist world, and integrating them in his installations, things that are considered worthless, and giving them a new meaning in his installation, and then having these exhibitions move around. That's also a comment on the loop or the circle of objects. And
Ask him if his house is, if he has one room full of things that he's collected.
I will let Stefan answer that.
Elle demande si tu as une pièce pleine de choses. He has filled houses. And now one house is full, and he says, why don't you build me another house?
That's where did I put that shoe? I don't know.
Non, personnellement, bon, de la manière dont je suis rentré dans le monde de l'art, ça me paraît toujours étrange. Je me dis, mais est-ce que c'est comme ça que bon, les gens deviennent...
Yeah, it's a surprise. He says he's always feels as a surprise to himself that he entered the art world, because he did not train becoming a painter or sculptor. George studied business law and business administration in Ivory Coast and in France, so he's not trained as an artist. So it's so.
How did you get connected?
I met George Adéagbo in 1998 in Sao Paulo, at the Sao Paulo Biennial. That's where I saw for the first time his work. I worked as a curator in Japan, and I went to see the Sao Paulo Biennial, and I saw his work, and I had the idea to invite him to do a one-day installation at the Venice Biennial in 1999 as an off event, which became an official event last minute, and he was one of the first, or maybe the first, artists from the African continent to get an award, jury of the Venice Biennial in 99. That's how we started to work together.
And I just also want everybody to know, for those of you who want to learn more about George, there are some books available down at the, well, actually over at the Morris studio, but be on the lookout because Stefan has just finished writing his dissertation on George's practice, and Skira Publishing House is interested in publishing it. So Stefan was working this morning on the English translation, so that you can, maybe you want to talk a little bit about.
I researched on George's way of writing and also in making objects talk. And the title of the book is a quote from him, because he says, my installations are like a law court, a tribunal of things, where the objects, the evidence I collect, I put it all together, but it's the visitors or the jury who has to study the pieces of evidence I collect and make their own judgment. So the book will be called Tribunal of Things. So I think we are all stuck together here and we'll be drinking.
I wasn't trying to take it away to make you stop talking, but actually, just so everybody knows, water is the blessing of the ancestors, and so we are all being blessed at this moment, so don't be worried about getting wet on your way to your car or as we imbibe. But maybe since it is raining, if somebody else has a question, we can.
And you're welcome to keep asking questions while we have drinks.
Absolutely. One more question.
George, merci beaucoup. And I wanted to ask you about the Andromeda, the choice to carve the Andromeda and put her up at the front. And I think that in the original myth, Andromeda is Ethiopian. But I'm wondering about choosing to feel that work of French to carve.
Non, elle a dit l'Andromeda. Tu as fait profil de l'Andromeda qui est noire. Est-ce que tu savais qu'Andromeda est d'Éthiopie? Tu as une intuition.
C'est comme t'as dit, c'est comme Cléopâtre aussi.
Yeah.
C'est une Égyptienne, Cléopâtre.
Yeah.
Moi, je ne savais pas que Andromeda est d'Éthiopie, mais tu as dit mon tour, ces femmes très historiques, elles sont le plus souvent d'Égypte.
So he had the inspiration, and it was maybe intuitive, but it was the right thing to do. And he was, I think, very moved also when he saw this sculpture here the first time, even in winter, you see. And it's also the last work of Daniel Chester French.
So,
Margaret, would you like to
maybe say some. Invite everybody to the next one.
Oh, thank you all for being here. I really love that the rain is a blessing. I invite you all out onto the piazza now to join us for a drink and to continue our conversation with George and Stefan. And I just wanted to thank you both very much for coming all this way to be here with us. Thank you, Karen. Yeah.
Thank you for your hospitality here. We love it. We don't want to leave. We stay here.
It's been a pleasure. George and Stefan have been staying with us at the Meadowlark, which is another little studio on the property. And they've become part of the family, as our artists and residents tend to do. And we're gonna miss you. I hope you come back. And Karen, thank you so much for coming all the way from Washington to moderate this really fascinating discussion, which has been recorded and will be available on our website. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.